They vanished overnight. No final battle, no desperate last stand, no ruins left smoldering in the wake of conquest. One moment they were there, a thriving civilization that had survived for centuries, and the next moment they were gone. Just empty cities, silent temples, abandoned streets that once echoed with a million voices. This isn't mythology or legend. This is historical fact, and it's far more unsettling than any war story you've ever heard. Because when civilizations fall in battle, we understand it. We can point to the enemy, the siege, the moment everything collapsed. But when a civilization simply disappears without fighting back, without even trying to survive, that's when you realize something far more terrifying was at work, something that made an entire people choose to walk away from everything they'd ever built. The year was 1450 AD, and the Khmer Empire was at the height of its power. We're talking about the civilization that built Angkor Wat, one of the largest religious monuments ever constructed by human hands. A temple complex so massive it covered over 400 acres. A city so advanced it had sophisticated water management systems that modern engineers still study in awe. This wasn't some struggling kingdom on the brink of collapse. This was a superpower. Over 600,000 people lived in the capital city of Angkor. To put that in perspective, London at the same time had barely 80,000 souls. Angkor was the largest pre-industrial urban center in human history. Its kings commanded armies that had crushed invasions from every direction. Its temples gleamed with gold and precious stones. Its markets overflowed with silk, spices, and treasures from across Southeast Asia. And then, everyone just left. They walked out of the most magnificent city on earth and never came back.
No enemy army marched through those gates. No plague swept through the streets, leaving bodies in its wake. No volcano erupted, no earthquake shattered the foundations. The city wasn't burned. It wasn't looted. It wasn't destroyed. It was simply abandoned, as if millions of people woke up one morning, looked at everything they'd built over centuries, and decided none of it mattered anymore. When French explorer Henri Moho stumbled upon Angkor Wat in 1860, he found something that shouldn't exist. A city frozen in time, swallowed by jungle, with no historical record explaining what happened. Local villagers told him vague stories about ancient kings and divine curses, but nothing concrete, nothing that made sense. The greatest civilization in Southeast Asia had been erased from living memory. Here's what makes this even stranger. The Khmer people didn't just abandon their capital, they abandoned their entire way of life. For 600 years, they built their identity around the god kings who ruled from Angkor. Every aspect of their culture, their religion, their social structure, everything centered on that city. And overnight, they walked away from it all. Think about that for a second. Imagine waking up tomorrow and everyone in your country simultaneously deciding to abandon every city, every town, every home, and just start over somewhere else. No explanation, no warning, no looking back. That's essentially what happened here, except on an even more dramatic scale, because the Khmer weren't just leaving behind houses, they were leaving behind their gods.
The temples at Angkor weren't just buildings. They were literal representations of Mount Meru, the center of the universe in Hindu-Buddhist cosmology. The kings who built them weren't merely rulers. They were believed to be divine incarnations, living gods who maintained cosmic order. To abandon these temples wasn't just abandoning real estate, it was abandoning the very structure of reality as they understood it. So what could possibly force an entire civilization to make that choice? What threat could be so overwhelming, so incomprehensible that fighting back wasn't even considered an option? Because that's the part that doesn't make sense. The Khmer had defeated the Cham.
They'd crushed the Vietnamese. They'd held off the Thai for generations. These were not people who ran from a fight, but they ran from something. Or maybe they didn't run. Maybe they simply recognized that what they were facing couldn't be fought with armies and weapons. Maybe they understood, in a way we're only beginning to grasp now, that some enemies don't come with swords and siege engines. Some enemies come slowly, invisibly, reshaping the world around you until the ground beneath your feet is no longer solid. The clues are there in the ruins if you know where to look. The unfinished temples, the irrigation channels that suddenly stop mid-construction, the royal inscriptions that grow shorter and more desperate with each passing decade, the shift in religious imagery from triumphant gods to scenes of suffering and cosmic dissolution. Something was changing, and the people who lived through it could feel it happening.
But here's the truly chilling part. Whatever destroyed the Khmer Empire, whatever force was so powerful that an entire civilization chose extinction over resistance, it's not ancient history. It's not some lost mystery from a forgotten age. The same thing is happening right now, all around us, and most people have no idea. Because the Khmer didn't disappear because of war or disease or natural disaster. They disappeared because they ran out of water. Not all at once, not in some sudden catastrophic drought. Slowly, gradually, over decades, the massive hydraulic system that sustained their civilization began to fail. The monsoons became unpredictable. The reservoirs that had fed millions for centuries started running dry. The canals silted up faster than they could be cleared. And here's the kicker. They did it to themselves. The Khmer had built the most sophisticated water management system in the pre-industrial world. Massive reservoirs called barrages that could hold millions of gallons. Canals that distributed water across hundreds of square miles. A network so complex it allowed them to grow 3 rice crops per year instead of 1. It was an engineering marvel that supported the largest city on Earth. But it was also incredibly fragile. Each generation of kings tried to outdo the previous one, building bigger temples, bigger reservoirs, bigger everything. They cleared more forests to make room for agriculture. They diverted more rivers to fill their barrages. They pushed the system harder and harder, always assuming the water would keep coming because it always had. Until it didn't. Until the deforestation changed rainfall patterns, until the massive weight of the stone temples began compressing and damaging the canal system beneath them, until the climate shifted just enough that the monsoons they depended on for centuries became unreliable. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sudden, it was just a slow, grinding pressure that built year after year until the entire system collapsed. And when it did, there was nothing to fight. No enemy to rally against, no villain to blame, just the terrible realization that they'd built their entire civilization on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. The water wasn't infinite. The land couldn't support unlimited growth. The gods weren't going to save them. So they left, not in panic, not in chaos, but in a kind of terrible resignation. They walked away from Angkor and scattered into the countryside, back to smaller villages, simpler lives, abandoning everything they'd achieved because continuing to fight for a doomed city made no sense. The last inscriptions from Angkor speak of the king performing desperate rituals, trying to bring back the rains, trying to restore cosmic order. But you can hear the desperation in those stone-carved words. They knew it was over. They just didn't want to admit it.
The silence must have been deafening. Imagine standing in the center of Angkor Wat as the last families gathered their belongings and walked away. The temple that took 30 years to build, that employed thousands of workers, that housed the physical embodiment of divine power on earth, now empty. No prayers echoing through the corridors, no offerings placed before the altars, no incense smoke rising toward the heavens, just silence and the creeping realization that the gods had abandoned their own house. But here's what the historians missed for over a century. The Khmer didn't just wake up one day and decide to leave.
The abandonment of Angkor was the final act in a drama that had been playing out for almost 200 years. The cracks in the system started appearing long before anyone was willing to admit they were there. And that's the pattern we need to understand, because it's the same pattern that's unfolding in our world right now. The first warning signs appeared in the late 1200s. The inscriptions from that period start mentioning water shortages for the first time in Khmer history. Not catastrophic droughts, just occasional problems with the irrigation system, canals that needed more frequent maintenance, reservoirs that weren't filling as reliably as they once did. Nothing that seemed insurmountable, nothing that suggested the end of the world.
So the kings did what kings do. They built more, bigger temples, larger berets, more elaborate canal systems. They treated the symptoms without ever questioning whether the disease itself was terminal. And for a while it worked. The system adapted. The water kept flowing, life went on. But each solution created new problems. When they built larger reservoirs, they had to clear more forest to make room. When they cleared more forest, rainfall patterns shifted. When rainfall patterns shifted, the monsoons became less predictable. When the monsoons became less predictable, they needed even larger reservoirs to capture water during the good years. It was a cycle that fed on itself, and every generation pushed it a little harder. The really tragic part is that some people saw it coming. There are inscriptions from the early 1300s where provincial officials are literally begging the king to reduce the burden on the water system. They're describing the exact mechanisms of collapse, warning that the whole thing is becoming unsustainable. And they were ignored. Not because the kings were stupid or cruel, but because admitting the problem was real meant admitting that everything they'd built their civilization on was fundamentally flawed.
That's the human element that makes this story so devastating. These weren't ignorant people blindly stumbling toward disaster. They were sophisticated engineers and administrators who understood hydraulics and agriculture as well as anyone in the medieval world. They saw the warning signs. They documented the problems. They just couldn't bring themselves to accept the solution, which would have required abandoning the very things that made them powerful in the first place. Because here's the impossible choice the Khmer faced. To save Angkor, they would have needed to dramatically reduce the population, scale back agriculture, stop building temples, and fundamentally reimagine what their civilization was. In other words, they would have had to voluntarily give up everything that made them the Khmer Empire. What king could make that choice? What population would accept it? It's easier to hope the next monsoon will be better, to believe the gods will provide, to assume that what has always worked will continue working forever. And for a while, hope almost seemed justified. The mid-1300s saw some good years. The monsoons came on time, the reservoirs filled. The crisis appeared to have passed. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief in the inscriptions from that period. See, we worried for nothing. The gods haven't abandoned us. We just needed to have faith.
But the good years were just a reprieve, not a solution. The fundamental problems hadn't gone away. The deforestation was still affecting climate patterns. The canals were still silting up. The system was still being pushed beyond its limits. And when the bad years returned in the early 1400s, they returned with a vengeance. The monsoons failed not just once, but repeatedly. Years of drought followed by catastrophic flooding that destroyed what remained of the irrigation infrastructure. The great berets that had sustained the city for centuries began to dry up completely. And this time, there was no recovery. The system had been pushed too far for too long, and it finally broke beyond repair. That's when people started leaving. Not all at once, not in some panicked exodus, just gradually, family by family, village by village. People made the rational calculation that staying in Angkor meant watching their children starve. The countryside still had water. Smaller communities could survive on rain-fed agriculture. It wouldn't be glorious, it wouldn't be the center of a great empire, but it would be alive.
The kings tried everything to stop the collapse. They performed elaborate religious ceremonies. They built new temples dedicated to water deities. They issued decrees reorganizing the labor system. They even tried military campaigns against neighboring kingdoms, hoping conquest would bring new resources and new glory to rally the population. Nothing worked. And here's the part that should terrify anyone living in the modern world. The Khmer collapse wasn't caused by ignorance or lack of technology. It was caused by the exact opposite. They had the most advanced hydraulic engineering in the world. They had detailed knowledge of agriculture and water management. They had centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to make their system work. And all of that knowledge, all of that sophistication couldn't save them, because the fundamental assumptions underlying their civilization were wrong. They assumed the water would always come. They assumed the climate was stable. They assumed they could keep growing forever. They assumed that the techniques that had worked for their grandparents would work for their grandchildren. And when those assumptions proved false, all their engineering expertise and administrative skill became useless. You can't engineer your way out of a problem when the problem is the engineering itself.
By 1430, most of the population had already abandoned the city. The royal court was still there, still performing the ancient rituals, still pretending everything was normal. But it was a charade. The power was gone, the water was gone, the future was gone. They were just going through the motions because admitting defeat meant admitting that everything their ancestors had built, everything they'd believed in, everything that gave their lives meaning was based on a lie. The final abandonment came sometime around 1450. The exact date is lost to history because by that point, nobody was maintaining the written records anymore. The king and his remaining court simply packed up and moved to a new capital near the coast, where maritime trade could sustain a smaller, more modest kingdom. They didn't announce it, they didn't make grand pronouncements, they just left. And Angkor, the greatest city in the medieval world, was swallowed by the jungle. Within decades, the temples were covered in vines. Within a century, the canals had completely disappeared under vegetation. Within 2 centuries, the local people had forgotten that their ancestors had built these monuments. It became legend, myth, a story about ancient gods and lost kingdoms that couldn't possibly have been real. But it was real. And the reason it happened is real. And the pattern that destroyed the Khmer Empire is playing out again right now across our modern world, in ways that would have been terrifyingly familiar to those last kings of Angkor watching their civilization dissolve around them. Here's the question that should keep you awake at night. If the Khmer Empire, with all its sophistication and power, couldn't save itself from a slow-moving environmental collapse that they clearly saw coming, what makes us think we're any different? Because the parallels aren't subtle. They're screaming at us from every direction, and we're doing exactly what the Khmer did, treating the symptoms while ignoring the disease, hoping that technology will save us, assuming that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow. The Khmer believed their hydraulic system could support unlimited growth because it had been working for centuries. We believe our industrial systems can support unlimited growth because they've been working for centuries. They kept building bigger infrastructure to extract more resources from their environment. We keep building bigger infrastructure to extract more resources from our environment. They ignored warnings from provincial officials who saw the system breaking down. We ignore warnings from scientists who see our systems breaking down.
And just like the Khmer, we're caught in a trap where the solutions would require giving up the very things that define our civilization. They couldn't save Angkor without abandoning the massive agricultural surplus that made them powerful. We can't solve climate change without abandoning the massive energy consumption that makes us powerful. They couldn't stop temple construction without undermining the religious authority of their kings. We can't stop economic growth without undermining the political legitimacy of our governments. The psychology is identical. When your entire worldview is built on certain assumptions,
When your power and status and identity are all tied to those assumptions, admitting they're wrong feels impossible. It's not just about changing policy, it's about changing who you are at the most fundamental level. That's why the Khmer kings kept building temples even as the water dried up. That's why we keep building economies even as the climate breaks down. But here's where the comparison gets really disturbing. The Khmer at least had somewhere to go. When Angkor collapsed, the survivors could scatter into the countryside and rebuild smaller communities that lived within the limits of their environment. They lost their empire, but they survived as a people. Where exactly are we going to go when our global systems start failing? There's no countryside to scatter into. There's no simpler way of life to fall back on. We've built a civilization that depends on incredibly complex global supply chains, and when those break down, there's no plan B.
The Khmer collapse took about 200 years from the first warning signs to the final abandonment. 200 years of gradual decline, failed solutions, false hopes, and denial. We've had about 200 years of industrial civilization, and we're already seeing the same patterns: rising resource stress, failing infrastructure, increasing instability, climate chaos, and the same response: build more, extract more, hope that technology will solve problems that technology created. You know what's even more chilling? The Khmer probably thought they were too big to fail. They'd survived for 600 years. They'd defeated every external enemy. They'd built monuments that touched the heavens. The idea that it could all just end, that the water could simply stop coming, must have seemed absurd. Civilizations don't just disappear, not civilizations like ours, not when we're at the height of our power. Except they do. They absolutely do. And the height of power is often exactly when the collapse begins, because that's when you're pushing your systems the hardest, when you're most convinced of your own invincibility, when questioning the fundamental assumptions feels like weakness rather than wisdom.
The archaeological evidence from Angkor tells a story that should be required reading for every political leader and CEO on the planet. It shows a civilization that had every opportunity to save itself. They had the knowledge, they had the resources, they had the time. What they didn't have was the ability to make hard choices that would have required them to become something other than what they were. So they chose collapse over transformation. They chose to be the Khmer Empire until the very end, even when being the Khmer Empire guaranteed there would be an end. And that's the real horror of their story. It wasn't inevitable. At dozens of points over those 200 years, different choices could have led to different outcomes: smaller population, less intensive agriculture, more sustainable resource use, a gradual transition to a different kind of civilization. But each of those choices would have meant giving up power, wealth, status, and identity in the present for the sake of survival in the future. And humans, whether medieval Khmer or modern Americans or anyone else, are really bad at making that trade. The last inscription from Angkor is dated 1747, nearly 300 years after the city was abandoned. Some dedicated priest or scholar went back to the ruins and carved one final message on a temple wall. It's a simple statement of faith, a prayer to the gods to protect the ancient holy sites. But there's a sadness in those carved letters that echoes across the centuries. The person who wrote them knew they were documenting the end of something that would never return. They were saying goodbye not just to a city, but to an entire way of understanding the world.
We might be carving our own final inscriptions right now, in scientific papers that nobody reads, in climate reports that politicians ignore, in documentary evidence of a civilization that saw the cliff approaching and couldn't bring itself to turn away. Future archaeologists, if there are any, will study our ruins with the same bafflement that we studied Angkor. They'll see all the warning signs we documented, they'll find all the solutions we proposed, and they'll wonder why we didn't act,
why we couldn't change course, why we chose to keep being ourselves even when being ourselves guaranteed our destruction. The answer, of course, is the same answer that explains the Khmer. Because change is hard, because admitting error is painful, because the future always feels less real than the present, because it's easier to hope that the monsoons will come back, that the water will return, that somehow everything will work out without us having to fundamentally change who we are or how we live. But here's the final bitter truth that the ruins of Angkor teach us. Hope without action is just another form of denial. Prayer without change is just noise. Technology without wisdom is just a faster road to the same destination. The Khmer had brilliant engineers, and they still collapsed. Having smart people doesn't save you if those smart people are working within a system based on false assumptions. The civilization that disappeared without a final battle didn't disappear because they were conquered. They disappeared because they conquered themselves, because they built a system so successful it destroyed the foundations it depended on, because they couldn't imagine becoming something different until it was too late to become anything at all. And if we're honest, really honest with ourselves, we'll admit that we can see our own reflection in their story. We're living in the good years right now, the ones that came before the final collapse, the ones where everything still mostly works and the problems are still mostly manageable, and we can still convince ourselves that we have time. The Khmer had those years too. They used them to build more temples. What are we building with ours?